Hello and welcome to Polity Matters. My name is Ben Ratliff, and today I am not joined by either of my normal co-hosts. I'm joined instead by our friend Fred Greco, and we're getting into BCO 40 on general review and control. Fred, thank you for joining me. I was feeling kind of inept to do this alone, but you more than make up for my two co-hosts, I think.
Glad to always be on, Ben.
Yes, sir. Students of the BCO will remember that when the jurisdiction of the church courts is discussed in BCO Chapter 11, we're told that although each court exercises exclusive original jurisdiction over all matters, especially belonging to it, the lower courts are subject to the review and control of the higher courts in regular gradation. And that review and control reference there is what Chapter 40 begins to address today. Fred, before we get into the details, I want to ask you this question. So a chapter ago, which you handled with us last time, BCO 39.1 lists the modes by which the acts and decisions of a lower court are brought under the supervision of a higher court. And they give us four things: review and control, reference, appeal, and complaint. Now, I often hear about the other ones, just in common parlance, right? Reference, appeal, complaint. People kind of know what those are. I usually hear about review and control more as like a category, as if it's like the umbrella term to cover the other three things. But 39.1 and the chapter we're in today, 40, seem to present review and control as an action in and of itself. And I know we're going to get into the details, but I was wondering if you could help parse that out for us a little bit, in the bigger scheme of things.
So I think, Ben, this is a little bit of both and. So review and control really is Presbyterianism. And by that, I mean you have entire courts acting with each other. This is not, a complaint brought by an individual. This is not an appeal in a discrete judicial case. It's not even a reference where one court asks another court to take up one particular matter. This review and control is really our book of church order, giving us the nuts and the bolts of how we're Presbyterian. So if I could put it this way, some people talk about Acts 15 as the first General Assembly, and I think that's true. It's probably also the first case of review and control, in which a local church sends up a matter for review by a higher court. Now, when higher courts do this review and control, there are different ways in which it's gone about, and that is different both when a presbytery reviews the session and when the General Assembly reviews a presbytery. And I, along with Scott, hope that a synod never reviews anyone ever, because there's never any synods. So, but this is, so there are different mechanisms, and we're going to get into the details, I'm sure, but they all come under that general umbrella that a higher court actually has a duty to review the lower courts. And I want to put it this way in the umbrella that's broad. It's not just to find mistakes and to poke at a lower court. When a higher court reviews records and declares that everything's good and it is in order, that should be an encouragement not only to the lower court, but to all of the members. So when a presbytery reviews the records of a session, the members of that church should feel good about their session and their government, because if there was anything grossly unconstitutional, to use a phrase, the presbytery would step in. And so if the members of a church don't hear anything about review and control, they should be happy. They should know that their elders are doing the right thing and doing things in order. Well, to use our life verse, decently and in order. And so, this is an important principle, not just for finding errors, but for showing that we are a connected church. So my PCA church, for example, in Katy, Texas, is connected organically to your PCA church in Cleveland, Mississippi. Now, we don't have a direct review and control relationship, but we are all operating under the same rules, under the principles of the scriptures in government, as we've agreed to. That's what the BCO is. It's our agreement as to what the scriptures teach concerning church government. And review and control is one of the things that ties us together.
That's good. I appreciate the thought there that we should maintain that positive spin as well. The approach to it. We hear a lot of negative stuff, but there's a positive thing going on as well, which we get into here. I think as we start off the chapter in section 1, it is the right and duty of every court above the session to review at least once a year the records of the court next below, and if any lower court fails to present its records for this purpose, the higher court may require them to be produced immediately or at any time fixed by this higher court. Back to BCO 11 as we think through this one, just kind of establishing the principle that's at play here. BCO 11:4 says these courts are not separate and independent tribunals, but they have a mutual relation, and every act of jurisdiction is the act of the whole church performed by it through the appropriate organ. And so because we are all one, it is the obligation of each court higher to review the records of the court immediately below it. So presbyteries need to take care to examine the records of the sessions, and General Assembly needs to take care to examine the records of the presbyteries. Let's talk about how this, well, unless maybe you've got thoughts on the principle itself, and then we can talk about how this happens.
This goes back again to our integrated relationship. Mm-hmm. It's the reason why, one of the things I say in my church polity classes is that we are the Presbyterian church in America. And then I will often ask, what is the Southern Baptist group called? It's the Southern Baptist Convention. Now, I know when you go to General Assembly, it can look a little bit like a convention, not as much. There's no ice cream social, so maybe that keeps us from being a convention.
And we're not there yet.
But there's an important difference there, mm-hmm. that we're related. And so if you just think of one, sort of obvious example, if a church was ordaining someone who was ineligible to office, ordaining someone to be an elder, whether it was not a man and instead a woman, or a man who could not subscribe to our standards, that would affect the higher courts, because that person would be an elder eligible to serve in a presbytery and serve on a General Assembly. And so you can't parse these things out. You can't say, well, we're only going to be together for these purposes, and we're going to be separate for all these other purposes. You just can't. And so this review and control is important to keep that connectionalism.
Yeah. So there's this instruction for us that it has to review the records at least once a year. So there's regular oversight occurring by these higher courts. When a lower court fails to present its records, the higher court has to request. In fact, I think let me go back. The higher court may require them. So they may, but then the requirement word is there too. So it's if they do, it's a strong thing. They need to bring those immediately. What happens when a court fails to respond to that request from a higher court? I mean, you got a session that just isn't bringing their minutes. What's a presbytery to do?
Well, it's interesting because what you see here in 40-1 is really most of what a session has instructions to be obligated to do. Presbyteries have much more instructions under our rules of assembly operation, because of our General Assembly Committee has its own rules. And so I often advise presbyteries in sessions to act analogously to the rules for the review of presbytery records. Usually the committee at a presbytery level is called the review of session records in doing that. But it can get a little bit difficult to get these things accomplished. So when I first became a teaching elder almost 20 years ago, I traded in my R for a T to become a teaching elder. Even though I'd been an elder for about a decade, and even though I'd served on General Assembly committees, I was new to the presbytery, and so I got placed on the Review of Session Records Committee, which is about as close to Presbyterian purgatory as you can get. And because I had a background as a ruling elder and a lawyer, I was made the chairman of that committee. And one of the things I immediately did was to come up with some rules as to what you do, not if, but when sessions don't submit things on time, because they just don't. It could be because they forget. It could be because they're not used to. It could be because they don't know. And so I think presbyteries should all have rules in their bylaws, standing rules, rules of operation whatever you would call, to basically follow along with the basic principles that we have for review of presbytery records. So like, if you don't submit your records, we're going to send you a notice. And if you don't respond to the notice, we're going to take some action. And I think presbyteries could deny seating delegates from a church if they don't submit their records. And so, I've dealt with this several times on the General Assembly level. Review of presbytery records has probably more often than any other type of review and control case sent to the SJC exceptions of substance from presbyteries for not submitting their minutes. And then, we've had to take action. And usually our action is to try to come alongside a presbytery, encourage them in how to do it right, and et cetera, and whatever. But ultimately, as we can get into the details a little bit later, the General Assembly could, A, fail to seat their delegates at the General Assembly, and B, they could kick the presbytery out of the PCA. Mm-hmm. Now, that sounds like kind of a nuclear option, but if you can't get a presbytery to even respond, then you're really left with no other option. But usually, in this case, it's just a matter of, trying to encourage, poke, say, come on, you really need to do this. It's usually not a matter of willful neglect or of rebellion. It's just, we got a new clerk and he didn't know what he needed to do and we're behind or something like that. And we have done this on several occasions. We've sent members of the SJC to meet with presbyteries to help them respond properly, because we want to do this in a brotherly fashion, not in an adversarial fashion if we can.
So, yeah, listeners, that's a helpful thought on how it works at the two higher courts. At presbytery, what you'll probably see is I've served in a couple different presbyteries that have done this in different ways. One presbytery had certain churches turning in their certain sessions, turning in minutes at certain meetings every year. So every first meeting, a third of the sessions would turn in their minutes, and they would just call up a standing committee. They'd ask for volunteers basically to meet over lunch and review the minutes submitted for that meeting. Then the presbytery I'm currently serving in Covenant, we have a church care committee, and the review of session minutes is given to that committee as a part of their regular work. And so they usually do it on an annual basis, so all minutes are due by mid-December, and they report at our February meeting. And so that's how you'll usually see it worked out. Fred, I can't think of any other ways that presbyteries have done review. Those are the two main ways, I think.
Oh, they are. And my presbytery, Houston Metro, does it the latter way that you've described. They have to submit their records, all churches, by a certain date, and then the review of records committee will look at them and respond to the sessions if there's any items of concern, and then continue down that path. But those are really the only two ways to do that, I think.
Yeah, I would. If there are any men listening that have any influence in these areas, whatever you can do to turn that into an electronic process for your churches and presbyteries, please do that. We still have to mail physical copies into our committee every December. I love the brother that's been chairing that committee. I think he just inherited that tradition, but still, work hard to turn electronic things on.
Well, and you can do that because, again, there's no particulars in the Book of Church Order.
Yeah.
And so that's just a matter for standing rules. And we have in our standing rules that they'll be submitted electronically.
Yeah, it's a handy way to do it. Okay. So that now we really get into some details. So they've got to review the records. Okay, what are they looking for? That's 40-2. In reviewing records of a lower court, the higher court is to examine 4 things: whether the proceedings have been correctly recorded, whether they have been regular and in accordance with the Constitution, whether they have been wise, equitable, and suited to promote the welfare of the church, and whether the lawful injunctions of the higher court have been obeyed. Per Almquist, by the way, I'm going to reference Per a couple times, I think, today. It is so nice to have that new commentary, if not for anything else, to have another name that we can reference, and another way of saying pretty much the same thing. That's not a slight on his commentary at all, but there's only so many things you can say about a book of church order. But he says, almost as if expecting the suggestion, the examination of records is not a pedantic exercise in petty details. So, lest you think that may be what it is, listener, it is certainly not. He points us to Morton Smith, who writes, "It is not constitutional. It is not constitutional regularity. It is not mechanical perfection that makes the church efficient for its end. It is the Spirit of Christ using the church as His agent." And I think, Fred, that hits on sort of the positive light you were trying to shine at the beginning, which is review and control is confirmation that churches are doing what they've been called to do, that presbyteries are being faithful in what they've been given to do. And so there's 4 areas that higher courts have to look for. First is just correct recording. Let me pitch this to you. Why is it important for courts to have proper recording of their actions?
Well, I think there are several reasons, Ben, and some of them aren't really controversial, but they're very important.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to have a record of what you've done for 2 reasons: for the history of the church, and so that the court can know what they've done. Now, this may sound commonsensical, but the number of times that I've been in a meeting, either of my church or another church, and the question has come up, what did we do about that? We had that matter come up like 15 years ago. What did we do? Well, if you haven't recorded it well in your minutes, you don't know. Have we always approved every individual member of a mission team? Or do we just approve the leader and then let the leader pick? And so this way a court knows what it's done and can follow a consistent practice. The other thing is there are important details for the history of the church. So, for example, a session should be recording baptisms. Now, that may seem, mundane the week after a baptism to put it in your minutes, but that could be very important to that family. There are instances, even in the present day, where records of baptism are used for personal identification for people. Not maybe as much anymore as 100 years ago, but these are important matters to observe. When you observe the Lord's Supper, that's recorded in your minutes, and how you have handled certain matters. And so, if you don't take a record of those things, you have no way of knowing or proving it's happened. You can't count on people to just remember things. And that's not a knock on people's memories, but people die, people move, and, to see the faithfulness of the Lord in a church. My church just celebrated our 25th anniversary last fall. And one of the things that we used as a record of God's faithfulness to us were our records, our minutes, seeing members joining the church and when they joined and who our first members were and, what our first Sunday school class was. And, all of these things, if you don't have them recorded, you don't have a history of your church. So it's not just to make sure everybody does things right and a higher court can make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. This is a part of the history of the church, which is a record of God's faithfulness to the church. I think that's very important.
Yeah. And a record even going so far back into Scripture, genealogies themselves in the Scriptures are an example of this, the history of God's faithfulness to His people. What about this idea of, let me scroll back up and find these words, whether, the second point here, whether they have been regular and in accordance with the Constitution. So you correct me if I'm wrong. Let me throw something out there. The regularity has to do with maybe you have an action that is proper, but it was taken improperly with regard to its process or its procedure. And so you want to make sure that courts are behaving regularly, doing things the way they're supposed to be done, and not doing the right things in the wrong way. Would that be a fair way to think about that?
Yes, it would. I'll give you an example that I'm aware of that when I first found out about it just blew me away. So I became aware of a church that when admitting new members did what every church in the PCA does, which is the session interviewed the person for membership, whether it was an initial profession of faith or a transfer or a reaffirmation of faith. And then after that interview was concluded, rather than asking the constitutional questions for admitting people to sealing ordinances, the new member was asked the evangelism explosion questions. And here's the thing that really, so you're laughing. They recorded that in their minutes. So it's not just that they forgot to do something. They actually recorded doing it wrong in their minutes. Now, I say that, we're kind of chuckling a little bit. I have nothing against the evangelism explosion questions. I don't even have anything against a session or a session commission asking those questions of people making a profession of faith. They're good questions, but they're not our constitutional questions. And so that's something that needed to be corrected. Now, why would that need to be corrected? We could say, well, they had a profession of faith. They believe in Jesus. That's all that's important. Well, if you don't ask someone the constitutional questions, if 10 years later a matter of discipline comes up and someone is charged with violating one of the vows to support the mission and vision of the church, how can you charge them with that when they've never taken that vow? Right? And so this is not just, again, to use Pear's term, it's not just pedantic. It's not just window dressing. It's something that, oftentimes when I talk to people about the BCO, they think the BCO is not important and the provisions aren't important because they're mundane, they're detailed. The reason we have the provisions we have is to prevent problems and to undo problems we've seen in the past. That's what they're there for. They're not there for just because, well, we've got, some time on our hands and let's do this. So wanting things to be regular and in accordance with the Constitution, that carries in all of the things that, your listeners should be well aware of as we talked about discipline and the purposes of discipline and, the rights of membership and when you get to complaints and appeals and, all of these things, rights of a congregation, they're all bound up together. And if a church isn't acting constitutionally, then biblical principles are being violated.
Pear draws out this point, kind of next to what you're saying, that failure to act constitutionally breaks the unity of the church as well. So it certainly may be that they're acting improperly and unscripturally, but that our Constitution is what binds us together. And so, and the questions are really good too. Like as an example, if one person over here got asked the EE questions and somebody over here got asked the 5 membership questions, well, they're not united together in their common profession. And that may seem technical to some people, but it's true that they have not professed the same thing in a public way as they join the visible church. And we want them to be together. To your point earlier as well, we're not a convention of churches, we're a church. And so regardless of where your membership is, we share the same Constitution and confession.
That came up even this year. So we had yet another attempt. Now, I've been doing this a long time, Ben. I've been an elder almost 30 years. And this was like the 5th or 6th time somebody made an effort to amend our membership vows. Oh, yeah. And I felt really bad for the poor brother from Eastern Carolina because you had a better chance of an ice cream social spontaneously happening at General Assembly than he had of getting 2 votes for that. It was just not going to happen. Yeah. And one of the strong arguments against it, I've seen this fail over and over and over again, is, well, if we change the vows, which we've had for 150 years, do current members have to retake the vows? Mm-hmm. Does that change membership? And I don't know what the exact polity answer is because we've never changed the vows, and I don't think we will. But that gets to your point. About every 5, 8, 10 years, somebody tries to change the vows and they go down in flames. And that's one of the strong arguments against it, is that, unity that we have together.
The third point here in 40-2 is that we review records of lower courts as to whether they've been wise, equitable, and suited to promote the welfare of the church. Some actions may be recorded properly, and they may be constitutional, to cover our first 2 points, but they might just be dumb or unwise or unpastoral. I want to ask you for an example. I didn't tell you I was going to ask you for that. If you have any examples or thoughts on that, Pear's got one too that we can pull in if we need to. But
this is a kind of a grab bag, and I think it could be, for example, you don't have to give detailed advice to someone who could be coming under process. But it would be very wise and it would be equitable to give them advice as to, they could get an assistant, they can call witnesses. These are the provisions in the book. All that you have to do is just tell them the book covers it. You don't have to give them any advice or anything. But I think it's wise. One of my general principles of polity, whenever anyone asks for advice, is do everything you can to avoid a potential complaint or appeal. Try to work together, try to advise, try to give, opportunities, try to get agreement on matters that are disputable. And I think courts would be well suited to do that. Just because something's constitutional doesn't mean it will come to a good end. And having sat on an appellate court now for 16 or 17 years, I can tell you that we've had occasions where we may sustain a complaint or sustain an appeal on this provision, because even though maybe the court has acted strictly according to the Constitution, they didn't do it in such a way as to be wise and equitable.
Now, can a higher court force a lower court to redo something, or is this just a matter of pointing out that such an action was unwise or unequitable?
No, I think clearly a higher court can send something back. Obviously, they can on a complaint, but we can skip ahead a little bit to 40-5.
Right. Yeah.
One of the remedies is to send it back and to say, do it right. Mm-hmm. And usually the higher court will say, by the way, this would be the right way to do it. You might want to do this.
Yeah.
I call that the paint by the numbers provision. You want to, because you don't want it ping ponging. You don't want to send it back down and then they give it a go and then they don't do it again. They send it back. You don't want to go back and forth. So, because again, I think in my experience in ecclesiastical litigation, it is far more likely for a court to have erred by not knowing or misunderstanding than by some sort of willful rebellion or unwillingness to act properly. I mean, the ratio there is like 98-2. I mean, it's not even close. And so the higher court would, I think, always do well to let the lower court know what the problem was and how they could fix the problem.
That's good. Well, the last one here in 40-2, they need to review whether the lawful injunctions of the higher court have been obeyed. And this seems to me to be sort of a summary statement here at the end. Like, of course, everything that we do is based on our Book of Church Order and our Constitution, our doctrinal standards. And so in that the highest court has the right to amend those with agreement, like everything that we have to do is in obedience to the injunctions of the highest court.
That's right.
So we're talking here BCO amendments. We need to make sure we're following things properly, that we've adjusted to shifts that have happened in the book. Is there anything else we need to keep in mind with this one? Yeah.
Yeah. So we became aware on the SJC a few years ago of us not having a formal mechanism to make sure that a lower court, whether it's a presbytery or it could be a session, because a case could come all the way from a session, is actually doing what we said they had to do. And so, we just assumed they did. But so we've started now in every one of our decisions, and I just wrote one this past week. We add something called recording in the minutes now, in addition to our summary of the facts and our statement of the issue and our judgment, we instruct the lower court to record our decision in their minutes. So we know everyone in that court knows what we've done. It's not just the clerk, it's not just the moderator. Everyone has access to that. And to also record any concurring or dissenting opinions. And then to show that they have taken actions that are in accordance with that decision. So again, in theory, a session's minutes would be reviewed by a presbytery, and a presbytery's minutes would be reviewed by the General Assembly's Committee on Review of Presbytery Records. So if we said, for example, to a presbytery, you need to reinstate this minister, and they didn't, we would know.
Mm-hmm.
And then we could take action upon that. And so I think that's the classic example of a lawful injunction.
Good. Super helpful. Okay. So let's cruise into 40-3. And the people said that me and Fred couldn't fill the time that four of us normally fill. Come on, guys. 40-3, it is ordinarily sufficient for the higher court merely to record in its own minutes and in the records reviewed, whether it approves, disapproves, or corrects the records in any particular. But should any serious irregularity be discovered, the higher court may require its review and correction by the lower. Proceedings in judicial cases, however, shall not be dealt with under review and control when notice of appeal or complaint has been given the lower court, and no judgment of the lower court in a judicial case shall be reversed except by appeal or complaint. So essentially it starts out by saying the higher court has to record its review of the lower minutes in its own minutes, but it gives us some stipulation too that there's a little more required in cases of serious irregularity. There needs to be correction. We've alluded to that a little bit just now in the previous section, and you may want to comment on these a little bit. So if there's a complaint or an appeal going on, judicial cases aren't to be dealt with until they're complete. And also, you can't reverse a judicial decision except by appeal or complaint. Is that the way we read that? Yeah.
So review and control don't cover those judicial cases, because if we could put it this way, there are more particular rules for review and control with respect to complaints and appeals.
Sure.
Because review and control is really a grab bag, right? And there's, as you notice in here, there's no time limitations, there's no filing limitations, there's not even any standing limitations. So a court could become aware of a problem from a secular newspaper or from a blog or from social media, that no one needs to have standing. But in judicial type cases, that is cases of complaint or appeal, there are very particular rules. You have to file within a certain amount of days. You have to do a certain type of filing. You have to file with certain courts. Those rules need to be adhered to. And you can't use Chapter 40 to trump them. Now, there's another aspect to this. It's not just preventing people from doing things. If I am charged and convicted by my presbytery, I want to control my appeal and present my evidence in my case. I don't want somebody else elbowing me out of the way under a review and control.
Yeah.
Same thing with a complaint. If I file a complaint, I'm the one that's taking the initiative. And I don't want someone, taking precedence over me because I've made the effort to do that. And I think we also need to understand that review and control is not a substitute for an appeal. So you can't overturn a conviction. You can't, deal with these things. And oftentimes people will try this. They'll try. And to be blunt, they'll look at the filing deadline, realize they've missed the filing deadline, and try Chapter 40. because they know they can't do it under 43 or under 42, complaints or appeals. And this is, again, the general species of review and control. And it's not that we don't have that particular, we just have particular rules for the particulars.
Okay. I'm especially curious about these last few sections. Well, I suppose I said that too early, especially about 5 and 6, but let's look at 4 to start with. 40-4, courts may sometimes entirely neglect to perform their duty, by which neglect, heretical opinions or corrupt practices may be allowed to gain ground, or offenders of a very gross character may be suffered to escape, or some circumstances in their proceedings of very great irregularity may not be distinctly recorded by them. In any of these cases, their records will by no means exhibit to the higher court a full view of their proceedings. If, therefore, the next higher court be well advised that any such neglect or irregularity has occurred on the part of the lower court, it is incumbent on it to take cognizance of the same and to examine, deliberate, deliberate, and judge in the whole matter as completely as if it had been recorded, and thus brought up by review of its records. You sort of just referred to this a second ago. I think we talked about a newspaper. Maybe I'm reading that wrong. Sometimes things are going to happen in a session or a presbytery that shouldn't happen, and probably they're not going to record those things. It's almost it's laughable almost that our book says this. In any of these cases, their records will by no means exhibit to the higher court a full view of these proceedings. But if the higher court becomes aware of in some form or fashion, and they can acquire that information, they can deal with it as if it was in the record.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very simple provision, but it's very important.
Yeah, okay.
It's basically courts can't hide actions by not putting them in their minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And what this says is if a court has taken an action, but it's not in the minutes, and a higher court becomes aware, a member of the lower court could make the higher court aware of it. A member of a church could make a higher court aware of it. It could be something common fame that's out, in the public, and the higher court then can act as if it were recorded. Now, let me be clear here. That doesn't mean that we hear a rumor that a court has done something and therefore they're convicted and censured. That means the higher court says to the lower court, there was this Facebook post that said y'all did this. Can you tell us what happened and why it wasn't recorded if it happened? And probably the vast majority of the time, the lower court would say something like, I don't know why that Facebook post was made. We never did that. Here's what we did. And what would happen is the lower court would formally answer that. So it wouldn't just be a guy saying, no, I don't think that happened. The court would, draft a response, approve the response, and then approve their clerk, whether it's a clerk of session or a clerk of presbytery, reporting that up to the higher court.
Mm-hmm.
So this is basically, omissions from minutes, but it follows the same process that if there's something in the minutes that shows a problem, that could be a species of 40-5.
Yeah.
You deal with it in the same way. This section is just saying you don't have to have a specific notation of an error.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into 45 because 40-5, I think people hear that those numbers thrown out occasionally. This is what it's about. When any court having appellate jurisdiction shall receive a credible report with respect to the court next below of any important delinquency or grossly unconstitutional proceedings of such court, the first step shall be to cite the court alleged to have offended, to appear before the court having appellate jurisdiction or its commission, by representative or in writing, at a specified time and place, and to show what the lower court has done or failed to do in the case in question. The court thus issuing the citation may reverse or redress the proceedings of the court below in other than judicial cases, or it may censure the delinquent court, or it may remit the whole matter to the delinquent court with an injunction to take it up and dispose of it in a constitutional manner, or it may stay all further proceedings in the case as circumstances may require. I have so many thoughts and questions here.
Let me start with one thing.
Yeah, come on. Yeah.
This is a provision that gives me hives. And the same reason that 31.2 does.
Yeah, uh-huh.
People talk about, I'm filing a 40-5, and the court needs to respond to my 40-5. In the same way, I'm filing a 31.2, and you need to satisfy me because of my filing. Yeah. No, sir, you do not. This is a court's prerogative. Now, you may bring a report to a court that's covered under this language. You could write a letter to the court and say, brothers of the higher court, you need to be aware that this is going on in one of your churches. But that's the end of it. You don't have standing. The court doesn't have to answer to you. You don't get a right to testify. You don't get a right to bring witnesses. You have no rights. You are a reporter. You are Jimmy Olsen, not Clark Kent Superman. All you are doing is sending a report. And the court can decide what it wants to do with it according to these provisions. And so, this is general review and control. And so again, men don't understand this, and they think that courts have to snap to it when they've done something that they think is a filing, when it's not.
Yeah.
And so someone can send a report to a higher court, and a higher court can look at this and go, well, that's not credible. We're not even going to look at it. The most frequent instance in which this happens is there are serial reporters. That is, persons who have made higher courts aware of about 143 things. And after a while, you're like, no, we're not going to listen to you. We know you got an axe to grind, and you're not credible because the previous 142 weren't credible, so you're not credible, right? So the court has to decide whether, first of all, it's credible. Then secondly, you see, it has to either be an important delinquency or a grossly unconstitutional proceeding. Now, these are not terms of art. If I'm trying to figure this out, the first place that I'm going, for an example, is Ramsey. That's the first place I'm going. And so, you may have noticed when your co-host put up a picture of all of his books on polity, one of them didn't have the author on the binding, and I told him, there's no Ramsey. Do you even polity? What are you doing? So Ramsey is, I think, the best place to go. Mm-hmm. Smith is a good place to go. And now I'd have to see what Almquist has. But not every delinquency is an important delinquency. Yeah. Now, what makes a delinquency important? I don't know. This is, dare I say it, it's like the Supreme Court's definition of pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Yeah, I think it's important. And differing courts can differ as to what's important and what's not. Same thing, I can tell you that it's not just something unconstitutional. Otherwise, the word grossly wouldn't exist in this provision. Mm-hmm. Now, what makes something really unconstitutional? No. But it's got to be more than just something, a little bit. And it has to meet those two tests. It has to be credible, and it has to either be an important delinquency or grossly unconstitutional proceeding. Now, all of that is just a report. That is not a finding. That's the beginning of the process. And then the court drives what it wants to do with the process. It could communicate with the reporter and say, give us more information, answer these questions for us. Is there anyone else that we should talk to about this? Are there any other records we should seek? They could talk to the lower court and say, tell us what you think of this, provide us some records. They can do small I investigatory work to figure out whether, there's even something here. And you'll notice here it says that it can cite the court to appear, but notice it says by representative or in writing. So, for example, we've had several 40-5 reports come to the SJC, and 90% of them are handled in writing. These are the questions we want you to answer. And they write them back, and we say 1, 2, 4, and 5 are satisfactory. Fix 3 and come back to us and do it that way. Now, we have had some instances where we've actually had appearances and we've had hearings. And again, a presbytery could do that with a session. And that is the prerogative here, of the court, and what it wants to do. And I actually think you're getting a little bit more than you asked for here. I actually think this provision gives the benefit of the doubt to the lower court. In other words, the lower court gets to decide whether they want to send a representative or whether they want to respond in writing. Okay. Now, of course, the lower court could say, we can't be bothered with you, higher court. We're just sending you a writing.
Sure.
And the higher court could say, well, that's nice. We don't find it satisfactory. Right. But I do think it's at the lower court's at least initial determination of how they want to respond. And then, the higher court can deal with it. And that's the rest of 40-5. It can, reverse what's happened. It could redress the proceedings, except for in a judicial case. It can censure the lower court. Now, this is an interesting thing.
I have a question about that. Yeah.
How do you
censure a court?
Well, then maybe we'll talk about that in a second.
Okay.
Or it can send it back, remit the matter with an injunction to take it up in a constitutional manner. Or it may stay all further proceedings in the case. So you can obviously see differences here. If a lower court is trying to actively do something unconstitutional, then the higher court could just say, stop it. Don't do it. If the lower court has already done something unconstitutional, the higher court can say, fix it. Or they can just say, we're fixing it for you. Mm-hmm. We're doing this. Right? So, something that wouldn't be a judicial, a judicial case, maybe a lower court has dismissed someone from membership unconstitutionally, and there's no judicial case on it. Maybe what the church has a pattern of, if you don't come to church at least once a month, after 2 months, they take you off the rolls, and they don't follow 38-4. Well, a higher court could say, no, that's not constitutional. You haven't followed the Constitution. 38-4 says what you're supposed to do, and you need to do it. And that wouldn't necessarily be a judicial case, because, for example, if you took someone off the rolls and didn't, under 38-4, send them a letter saying that you were taking them off the rolls, and if they didn't want to be taken off the rolls, they would have the right of having a case of process. That would be an instance where someone wouldn't even know they had a right to have process because they'd never gotten notification of it. Well, a higher court could say, you can't do that. Mm-hmm. And we're going to restore those people to membership. And again, that shows our connectionalism, Ben, because your presbytery or my presbytery could restore someone to membership in our churches because our churches have violated the Constitution. Yeah. You can't do that in a congregational Baptistic context.
No, and for anybody who's listening, that you take great encouragement at that reality in our Presbyterian system, that there's a church can do something wrong and the members need not suffer necessarily.
Correct. And I think what should really be encouraging to people is not that there are hundreds of examples of this happening in the PCA and it being fixed, but the very fact that there's a mechanism means churches do the right thing.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right.
It's like when I was a kid, my parents said to me, you do know if you lie to us, we're going to know you're lying. Now that I'm an adult and a grandparent, I realize that's not exactly true. But it sure kept me from wanting to lie because I didn't want to get caught. And I knew they were going to catch me. And so it kept me on the straight. It was one of the ways that kept me on the straight and narrow. And I think just the fact that we have these mechanisms helps us to do things in a proper and biblical fashion.
Well, my question is about the censuring, but let's do 40-6 because I think I can ask it in the context of this last paragraph. To 40-6, in process against a lower court, the trial shall be conducted according to the rules provided for process against individuals, so far as they may be applicable. So, my question in the previous section was going to be, how do you censure a lower court? What does that look like? Because we have censures for individuals, obviously. I don't think I know what that looks like for a court to be censured. This 40-6 is essentially laying out what a process would look like against them. Same as individuals. The lower court is the accused. They walk through the process.
Rules of evidence, witnesses, things like that. That's what that's referring to. Now, censure, again, there's no...
they're convicted.
Yeah, there's no explicit provision here. And I can't recall off the top of my head what Smith says. I haven't looked at Almquist on this. I can tell you what I think it means. I think the analogy is this. You could certainly admonish a lower court. That's easy. It's the same as when you admonish an individual. Mm-hmm. I think suspension from the sacraments is analogous to seating commissioners in the higher court.
Okay.
You're suspending them from participation. Okay? So just like you could be suspended from the sacraments for a definite period of time or an indefinite, well, not from the sacraments, but from office, definitely, and from the sacraments, indefinitely, you could do that until there's sufficient repentance and etc. I think the analogy to excommunication is a higher court has the ability to remove the lower court from participation in the higher court. So being a part of the Presbyterian Church in America is a voluntary association, right? So chapter 25 makes it very clear that on 30 days' notice, this is chapter 25, section 11, on 30 days' notice, a church can hold a congregational meeting to leave the PCA, and unlike some other denominations like the OPC and like the EPC, they don't even have to have a reason. There doesn't even have to be any reason given at all or debated. They can just say, we voted and we left. And it's effective immediately. But the voluntarism works both ways. So a presbytery or a congregation can't say to the higher courts, you have to keep us even if we flout your constitution. So a higher court can dismiss a lower court from the body. Now, this almost happened in our history. If you recall, you may be a little young to remember the Federal Vision controversy in Louisiana, but one of the remedies that was coming down the pike, there was a trial, there were charges made against Louisiana Presbytery under 40-5. It was a 40-5 that came from several presbyteries. Charges were proffered. A prosecutor was appointed. It was my good friend, ruling elder Sam Duncan. He had assistant prosecutors appointed, and a trial, date was set. And then the individuals and churches that were at issue voluntarily left the PCA. But if they hadn't, the whole presbytery was going to be on trial because they had allowed this to happen. And if convicted, that whole presbytery would have been kicked out of the PCA. Mm-hmm. And the idea would have been that the whole presbytery and all of its churches would have been dismissed from the PCA. And the churches that did not have part in the error and wanted to stay in the PCA would have petitioned to come back in. And they would have been assigned to another presbytery. And that's kind of a nuclear option. But there are instances in which a higher court really can't do anything other than that. And so it hasn't happened. I haven't heard, I know there hasn't been a presbytery that has been dismissed from the PCA. I don't think I've heard of a church that's been dismissed from the PCA. I'm sure it's happened. But a presbytery could do that. A presbytery could vote and say to a church under BCO 13.9, we are dismissing you. Again, that voluntarism goes both ways.
Yeah. Super helpful. And you may have said this in a way, to help any clarity that listeners may need. So with an individual, censures remove those things which the church has granted to those members. Seat at the table, table, fellowship, membership in the congregation. Those things can be removed when they've been convicted of an offense.
Right.
And so the analogy would carry up further: seats at presbytery for a church, membership in the presbytery for a church, even further up the presbytery, seats, well, you didn't say seats at GA, but membership in the General Assembly as a whole. Those things which the higher court gives to the lower, and analogously,
yes.
Back to members. Okay. Just want to make sure I'm thinking about it properly. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any specific litigation that makes those analogies. And I haven't seen a case. If I had, I'd have written an opinion that said what I just said. But it does make sense, and I've talked to others about that. And I'm not sure what else there could be. Because remember, this gets back to all of our general principles that goes together with the book, that our authority is ministerial and declarative.
Yeah.
So a presbytery couldn't fine a church, right? A presbytery couldn't make a church, do mandatory service or something like that.
They couldn't go lock the church up until they repented and then let the members back in after. Right.
That's correct. Yeah. And that's especially true in the PCA.
Yeah.
We've guarded against that because those abuses happened in the PCUS, where literally locks were changed and, passwords changed and presbyteries took over buildings. Yeah. But yet, having ministerial and declarative authority doesn't mean we have no authority. We certainly have authority. And while on the one hand, someone might say, well, big deal, you could kick this church out of the PCA. They won't care. They'll just go along on their own business. Well, no, that actually says something. And it says something not just to the PCA, but if a church got kicked out of the PCA, the OPC would take cognizance of that. The ARP would take cognizance of that. I would dare say that even the Southern Baptist Convention would take cognizance of that and say, wait a minute, these folks all of a sudden became Baptists because they had trouble in the PCA and got kicked out. We don't want them, right? I mean, I think, it's a declaration, which is in any kind of discipline, that's what it's meant to do. And then ultimately, in theory, would be to drive the offender, if I can use that phrase, to repentance and a change in attitude and in action. And again, that's where the analogy would play out.
Yeah, that's helpful. Well, as Scott and Jared would say, this podcast is over. Now, I didn't reference it at the beginning. Jared is doing something with children this week. I think he's helping in like a kids camp maybe for the presbytery. Scott's sons have lead poisoning. No, that's not true. That's a terrible clip. I think it was a typo when he texted that to us. I don't think his children have lead poisoning. I think his house has some kind of lead poisoning or something. Anyway, y'all can check in on them if you want to. But we're grateful for Fred for joining us. Listeners, thank you for joining us. If you're interested about anything else that we've mentioned, you can check out the show notes in your podcast player or at politymatters.org. If you've enjoyed the show, do follow us on Twitter or Facebook at Polity Matters, and be sure that you're subscribed in your podcast app of choice. If you have questions or comments, you know that you can contact us at polymattersfeedback@gmail.com, and there's also a link below to support our work if you'd care to do so. Thanks again for spending time with us. Until next time, Fred, say goodbye.
Goodbye. Thanks.
Y'all take care.